Hi everybody, my name is Louis, and in today's video I'm going to teach you how to create this sound wave effect I did with Blender and geometry nodes. You will learn some basic principles like how to instance some curves on a surface and align it to its normals. You will learn how to create a sine wave effect, basically recreating a simple wave modifier but inside of geometry nodes. And finally, I'm going to teach you how to export some mask from geometry nodes to the shading tab in order to stylize the effect and bring it to life. I will be giving the file of the speaker I modeled for this effect in case you want to recreate the exact video. So if that sounds like something interesting to you, let's dive right in. So here I am into a fresh Blender file, and I'm going to open a geometry node tab on the cube. Delete the group input and start with a mesh circle. So the mesh circle has got points as we can see, but I'm going to increase it in order to increase the number of points. Then I'm going to transform this mesh in points using a mesh to points node. So right now it's pretty linear and basic, but I'm going to give it a bit of randomness in order to displace it a bit. So in order to do that, we need to use the set position node, which is going to allow us to move the points according to something. So what I want to do is random. So I'm going to use a random value and set it to vector. If I plug that into the offset, we can see everything is going a bit crazy. So I'm going to zero that out and start moving the points slowly. So I'm going to use shift and left click on the z-axis here and bring it to 0.03 and do the opposite on the minimum side. So -0.03 seems like something good. And I'm going also to display them on X and Y just a bit. So 0.01 seems like something good. Then we are going to instance the curves onto the surface. So in order to do that, I'm going to search IOP for instance on points, press enter and plug that in. As I said, we are going to instance some curves, so I'm going to search for curve line and place it into the instance socket. So right now you can see that the curves are going on the z-axis, and I want them to basically go outside of the circle. And by default, the mesh circle has got normals. So what I can do is use a normal node and align the rotation of our curves to its normal. But it's not doing anything right now, because basically it's using the normal of the points, and those don't have any normals. So what we can do is capture the normals of our circle and plug that right into the vector, and we've got our effect. I'm going to decrease the radius of the circle, and that is the first part done of the effect. So I can select all the node, press Ctrl J in order to create a frame, select the frame and press F2 in order to rename it, and I'm going to call that instancing. Okay, so now let's do the sine wave effect. So as for the points, we need to move the points of the curves. And in order to do that, well, we are going to use a set position node 2. And we want to move those points on the z-axis. But right now, if I plug anything in this socket, it's going to move on all axes. So I need to separate this vector, and with that I can use the combine XYZ node because it's going to give me individual sockets for each of the axes. Next, what I need to do is get the position of each of those points and get their lengths. So, what does the lengths node do? Basically, it's giving us the lengths of each of the mesh we are using. Right here, I've got a simple example. I've got a line that's exactly 1 meter in length, and each of these points are spaced by 0.1 meter. If I open my geometry node tab and recreate the effect, lengths, combine XYZ, and plug that into the Z, we can see that now it's mapping all those values from going from 0x to 1x onto the Z-axis. So if I do a instance on points, instance some basic points for visualization, we can see that the point that is on 0.1 meter on X will be mapped on 0.1 meter on X and Z axis. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And in order to go further, to create the sine wave effect, well, there is a function in the basic math nodes which is called sine. Let me delete that. And it's going to map all of this into a sine wave. There is a way to increase the frequency of the sine wave, which is to just duplicate the math node and set it to multiply. And if I multiply that by 2 pi, you just have to type tau in this socket, you will get a basic sine wave. I can resample the curve for it to be smoother. And that's it. If you increase the frequency, you get more waves. And just after that, you can duplicate the math node and set it to add or subtract in order to offset the curve. So hopefully you can now understand that if we do that on a mesh and on each of the points, we will have like a wave modifier basically. So let's go back to our project and use 3math node and plug that into the Z-axis. Set this one to sine, set this one to subtract, and this one to multiply. So now we have another problem. It's not creating the sine wave. Why? First, because we are dealing with instances right now, and basically instances, it's treating the whole mesh as one block. So we need to realize the instances. And now we've got a starting point. Now the second problem is that we are instancing a curve line. And by default, a curve line is made out of 2 points. The start point and the end point. So we need more points basically. So we can use a resample curve in order to get more points. You can use it here and set it to lengths and decrease to 0.05. It's going to have each point spaced by 0.05 meters. So now if I do like on the other project, increase the frequency, we are starting to get the effect, but it's quite high for the moment. So if you want to dial that back, you can use another math node after the sine wave and set it to multiply, and it's going to decrease the range of the effect. So it's going to go from basically a sine wave goes from -1 to 1, as you can see, -1 and 1. And if you decrease that, you can get a smaller range. But we are not going to use that for the moment because I want to go from 0 to 1 So what I can do is use a map range node, and it's going to clamp all the -1 values to 0. As you can see, it's on the base. And if I want to go less high, I can decrease the 2 max value of the map range. Okay, so that's the sine wave. And we are going to add a bit of noise in order to break this linear effect. And in my example, I used a magic texture. I'm going to duplicate the map range with Shift D. Reset it by pressing backspace while hovering over the node. Plug the color into the value, and we are going to multiply this as you will do any texture in shading. So we can just use a basic mask node because we are dealing with black and white values. We don't need to use a mixed color. Increase the depths, and I think we need more points, so I'm going to decrease again the value on the resample curve. Going to change the scale, and yeah, we've got something a bit more organic, you know. Okay, so what I did was only have one wave, and right now we have multiple waves, so you can just decrease the multiply value until we got one wave per cycle, and just dial that in depending on the length of your curves or the size of the size, sorry, of your object. You can also play with the contrast of your sine wave, you know, have it tighter or broader. And that's this part done. So we can group those nodes, select them, Ctrl J, and rename the frame. How do I rename it? Sine wave. Okay, so now we can give a mesh to those curves in order to see them while rendering, because we're not gonna see anything if we render this. So we can just convert those curves into a mesh. So I'm gonna type CTM in order to get curve to mesh, and CC in order to find the curve circle node. We have something pretty big right now because, because the radius of the curve circle is pretty big. So if I decrease that, you can see we are getting some sort of hairs. But they all have the same size, and there is a way to randomize this, which is using the set curve radius. By default, the set curve radius gives a pretty small radius, so if you decrease this, you're gonna get some pretty small stuff. So just set that back to 1, sorry, and you have something small. As you can see, if you're a beginner in geometry nodes, we've got 2 different sockets. This one is round because it only uses some normal values, and the diamond socket can get some fields. Basically, we can input a random value in it. And if we do this, plug that in, in 0.05, we are getting a random value, but on each of the points of those curves. You see, like this point is going to get 0 radius, while this one has got a certain amount, and etc, etc. And what I want is each of those curves to have a homogeneous, I guess, random radius. So there is a node for this, which is called the curve info node, and if we plug the curve ID into the ID socket of the random value, well, basically the radius of the curve is going to be the same all along. You see, if I change the seed, we get some different results. Sorry. And I don't want them to be equal to 0, so I'm going to set that back to 0.002, I guess. And that's the meshing done. So we can frame that, F2, and call it meshing. So now we can play with this effect, you know, it's still pretty procedural. You can increase or decrease the radius of your basic mesh, change the amount of curves you have. You can use a pretty high amount, you know, depending on your computer. We can change the size of the curves, change the scale of the texture, and so on and so forth. You get the idea, right? Okay, so now let's give this a material using the set material node, and I'm going to drag the panel in order to open the shading tab. I know that the shading tab is right after the geometry node tab, so I'm going to press Ctrl and scroll down on this icon in order to open the shading tab. It's faster than going into the menu to me. And I'm going to call the material curves. Set it here too, because we need to reference it inside of our geometry node tree. And now I'm going to teach you how to transfer a value from your geometry node tab inside of the shading tab, sorry. So in order to do this, we need to use a store named attribute node in order to store some values, and we can call them using the attribute node inside of the shading tab. What do I want to transfer? Well, first I want to transfer the sine wave in order to have a mask, in order to switch between a non-emissive material and an emissive material. So what I can do is duplicate the map range by pressing Ctrl Shift and D, Alt P, so it's not in the frame anymore, and set it to 1. I'm going to call this attribute mask, Ctrl C and Ctrl V here. If I press Ctrl Shift and left click on this node, go into the render mode, we can see we've got our mask. If I just unplug that, there isn't anything. And if I move my offset, you see we have the effects going through. So basically the base material is going to be like something pretty rough and diffuse, like this. And the other material is going to be emissive, as I said. So I'm going to press Ctrl Shift and right click, then drag onto the emission node in order to get the mix shader, and plug the attributes inside the factor. So now, as you can see, we have our emissive material where the white of our sine wave is appearing. So that's the first part. Now, what I want to do is having a bit of randomness on those curves, because we only have one solid color. So what I can do is duplicate this curve info and random value, Alt P, duplicate the store named attribute, and call it rand for random. I'm going to set the random value to 0 and the max to 1. Reset the seed and plug the result into this socket, this value socket. Inside of the shading tab, I can duplicate the attribute node, Ctrl C and Ctrl V our attribute name, and now we can see we are getting a random value going from 0 to 1 on each of our curves. Yeah. Here we can see we have 0 and 1, and in the middle too. So what I can do now is use a color ramp, preview it using Ctrl Shift and left click on the color ramp, set it to constant, and we are going to give it some colors. So I think in my example I use some kind of rose, purple, blue, and cyan. I guess I had something like this. And now we are having some randomness on our curves. Let me increase the strength so it pops a bit more. And as you can see, we are transitioning between the diffuse material and the emissive material. There is another way, just to show you that you don't really need to use the random color. In this case, the random and star attribute name. There is a node inside the shading tab which is called geometry, and you have a random per island. So if I Ctrl-Shift-click in order to cycle to this, you see we are getting a random value on each mesh island of this entire mesh. So that's another way to do it, but I like to use a store named attribute because it's more versatile, you know. I could use some kind of noise texture, and I'd have this. It's ugly, but you get the idea, right? Let me plug that back. And now I want to bring it a little bit further. Like what I want to do is having some sort of transition from one color on the center of this mesh to all of these colors. What do I mean by that? Well, if I duplicate my color ramp and preview it there, I'm going to get rid of the blue and I don't know, like add some red or some stuff, you know. Yeah, we've got this. And basically I would like to have a part of this mesh that is all those colors and another part that are all those colors, and transitioning between those two. So what I can do inside of here is using the texture coordinate node, and we get the object coordinates. I can reuse that length node we did inside our geometry nodes. Come on. Vector map. Here. Set it to length. And if I use a color ramp, reset it back, and push that black stop, we see we're getting a mask. So I can use this to mask between those two values. I'm going to use a mix color, leave it to mix, and plug the color inside the factor. Right now it's not the way I want it, so I'm going to keep the mix color selected and press Alt S to switch between the two sockets. Reorganize the nodes, and here we have a transition. I can play with how big I want it to be, how harsh I want it to be, like set it to ease maybe. And now if I use the entire shader, you will see that at the start of the effect the curves are all rows, and the more the effect goes, well, they change color basically. So right now the colors are a bit trash, but I hope you get the idea, right? So yeah, that's the effect done. Basically, you can have a lot of fun with this. You know, you can change the contrast of your wave. You can also play with this contrast, you know. You can change, as I said, the scale of the texture, the contrast of the texture. You can also change how they are displaced on the mesh, you know. But I'm going to leave it at that. Alright, and that's the effect done. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you have any question, ask them in the comment and I'll try to answer as best as I can. Feel free to tell me what you liked or disliked about this video. Tag me on Instagram, with your sick-ass renders so I can have a look at them. And yeah, that's all for today. Have a nice day and take care.